webinar series. I hope that everyone is safe and that their families as well during these challenging times and during this glorious time in the shadow of the wonderful holiday of Pesach. Tonight, we have a very impressive speaker, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Lerner. He is a highly qualified individual with a long resume. He received smicha, rabbinical ordination, from Ner Yisrael. He's currently on the faculty of Yeshiva University in the Judaic Studies Department. He earned a PsyD in psychology and has a private practice. He is the founder of the Strategic Family Solution, which is a psychology practice which focuses on three areas. Number one, in guiding parents to educating their children with proper values. Number two, he's an expert in the human side of estate planning. Number three, and he has an expertise in guiding families to understand family dynamics and how families feed off of one another. He happens to have a specialty in dealing with anxieties, something that we could all use a little guidance during these trying times. That is his specialty in his practice. And tonight, he's here to give us some guidance, how to strengthen ourselves, how to find some chizuk, some comfort in dealing with these challenging times, specifically through the prism of the Pesach holiday and the Seder. He's going to present how the Seder can serve as a model and a guide how to manage our anxieties during this challenging time. It's a great honor to have him join us this evening to present to us. Dr. Lerner, are you there now?
I am here.
Okay, so if you kindly could begin at this point. We're going to accept questions afterwards. Anyone who has a question, I'll serve as a moderator. They could kindly just type in their question, and I'll read to you the question, and then you have the ability to respond to the questions.
Okay. First of all, it's a pleasure to be joining you. I apologize that for some reason my video is not working, but trust me, those of you who know me know that you're not missing much by not seeing me. Hopefully, my words will be able to be helpful and provide some perspective and some inspiration and motivation before we enter the Pesach holiday. In 1916, one of the most successful matzah manufacturers in the United States was the Pacific Coast Biscuit Company. They were located in Portland, Oregon. And each year, as the spring approached, the Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Tribune of Portland, would carry the following advertisement. Quote, "This trademark stands for supreme quality." And resting above the headline was a large, conspicuous swastika. And the ad continued, "Whenever you see the famous swastika sign, just remember its significance to the fathers and its present meaning. Then it meant brightness and prosperity. Today it is the symbol of purity and quality. When buying matzos, the swastika is your surety of purity." This was the copy from the ad of the Pacific Coast Biscuit Company, and it's no joke. For 5 years, this company sold matzos sealed in a carton that was branded with a swastika. Until Hitler unfurled his new red banner in 1921, the swastika was merely a symbol of good luck. But to our modern eye, what greater contradiction could there be than swastika on a box of matzah? And it might sound very ironic, but it could be argued that this company may have actually gotten it right. Because if we look at the Haggadah, our guidebook for the Pesach night, we'll find that the Seder is replete with contradictions. In fact, I'd like to argue that every symbol at the Pesach Seder represents opposing ideas. Towards the beginning of the Seder, we recite the Kaddish. We say the bracha, a blessing over a cup of wine, and we sanctify the day with Kiddush. We have 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Each one of them recalls a reference in the Torah to redemption, one of the four Lashonot Shel Geula, one of the four languages of redemption. So the wine represents royalty, it represents the regal nature of the Seder night, and it's customary to use wine. And one of the customs, one of the symbolisms that is given for red wine is to remember the bloodshed in Egypt. And while we recline while we drink the wine, we also spill a drop from the cup of wine for every one of the 10 plagues that we enumerate, to remember the lost lives in Egypt. So within the wine itself, we have both a symbol of our redemption, of our freedom, and a reminder of human suffering. One of the questions of the Manashtana, which is asked on the Seder night, is why do we dip twice? We dip the karpas, we dip a vegetable in salt water, we dip the marar in charoses. So on one hand, dipping represents our aristocracy. But when you think about it, what are we dipping into? We're dipping the vegetable into salt water to remind us of the tears that were shed by our ancestors in Egypt. And the marar, the bitter herbs, which we'll discuss soon, we dip into charoses. We dip into this mixture of apple and cinnamon to remind us of the mortar, of the bricks that the Israelites had to make when they were enslaved in Egypt. Yet the charoset itself, this thing that represents the sufferings of hard labor, has a sweetness to it. Once again, something which seems, and which indeed is appears as internally contradictory. Let's talk about marar itself. Marar, the Haggadah tells us, it represents the bitterness, how the Egyptians embittered our lives when we were slaves in Egypt. We don't recline when we eat the marar, whereas we do recline when we drink the cups of wine. So when we eat the marar, though, we don't recline because we're reminded of the bitterness, our enslavement. Yet we dip it in charoses, we dip it in this sweet stuff. But the custom, unbeknownst to many people, the custom is actually not to eat the charoses with the marar, but rather to shake it off. Now, there's a second time we eat marar. The second time we eat marar, the Haggadah tells us, is zecher lemikdash. We follow the tradition of Hillel the elder, who would take matzah, he would wrap it in marar. Their matzah resembled more like a lafa than the matzah we have nowadays. So it was flexible. He would wrap the marar in his matzah, and he would eat it reclining. And indeed, when we eat the marar in the way that Hillel, the sage, used to eat the marar, we also recline. Once again, representing not suffering, but royalty. Indeed, that tradition of Hillel comes from the times of the temple and goes back to the earliest times when the people would bring a Passover offering, the carbon Pesach, which was a roasted lamb. And if you think about it, it was quite delicious. It's like the shawarma that a person would buy nowadays. You have roasted lamb in a lafa, and marar would actually serve as a condiment. So this was representing the celebration, the redemption from the land of Egypt. So built into marar as well, we have this contradiction. There are other customs. Many people have a custom of eating a hard-boiled egg on the Seder night. The hard-boiled egg both represents the carbon chagiga, the holiday offering that was brought in temple times. But an egg represents something else. And anyone who has sat Shiva or been to the home of a mourner knows that there's a custom for mourners to eat something that's round. And an egg is representative of that, reminding us of avelut, of mourning. We recline when we drink the 4 cups of wine. We recline when we eat the matzah. Once again, representing the regal nature of the evening, representing our freedom. We sit up straight when we eat marar, representing our servitude and remembering the bitter times in Egypt. But then we recline when we eat them together, which goes to it begs an even greater question of the first Passover, the first Pesach that was celebrated in Egypt. Consider this, that the very first Passover in Egypt, here you have the Israelites. On the dawn of their redemption, they've been enslaved for centuries. They've suffered greatly, but now they've witnessed the 10 plagues. They're about to leave. There is death that's occurring all around them in Egypt with the last plague of the slain of the firstborn. There's mayhem everywhere. Is this really time to sit down for a formal family meal? Remember, they haven't been redeemed yet. Now, we know, of course, every Jewish holiday has to be celebrated with food. And even Rosh Hashanah, even our Day of Judgment, is a Yom Tov. We have a celebratory meal. We have apples dipped in honey. We have honey cake. Even Yom Kippur, which is a serious day of the year, nevertheless, it is a law. It's required to eat and to have a festive meal before Yom Kippur begins. So we go in with a full stomach. So on this evening in Egypt, when the Israelites were eating the Passover offering, there was a commandment not to break the bones, the etzem lo tishbaru, not to break the bone when you were eating it. Now, one of the reasons that's given for this is because having to break the bone and eating the marrow from inside the bone is representative of someone who is lacking, someone who can't afford a lot of food. And okay, this is a way of squeezing every bit of nutrition, every bit of food out of this meal that's being eaten. So here specifically, we don't break the bones, representing that we're aristocracy, representing this is how a king would eat a meal. A king doesn't have to break a bone. There's plenty of meat. Nevertheless, the same Torah commands the person eating to eat with their belt buckled and with their staff in hand, b'chipazon. Eat as if they're on the clock. We're in a hurry, even though we weren't leaving Egypt till the next day. So once again, we have this contradictory theme, even in the observance of the first Pesach itself in the land of Egypt. In the Torah, our liturgy refers to Pesach as Chag HaMatzot, the festival of Matzah. And there's two specific statements in the Haggadah which deals explicitly with the reason for Matzah. The first is towards the beginning of the Haggadah. The Haggadah says, Halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors, that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. Okay, so matzah is identified as with our suffering. Secondly, there's a section when we get to the part of the Haggadah that says, if you haven't discussed these three things, you haven't fulfilled the entire mitzvah of learning the story of the Exodus of the Seder night. Rabbi Gamliel Haya Omer. Rabbi Gamliel says the reason for eating matzah has to do with the fact that the dough of our ancestors didn't have enough time to become leavened when they were redeemed. They were rushed out of the land of Egypt. They were driven out. They couldn't delay at all. So matzah itself has two contradictory themes. First, we're told the matzah is the bread of affliction, symbolic of servitude and poverty. On the other hand, the matzah commemorates the manner in which we left Egypt. It's baked quickly on our path towards liberation. So I want you to think about this, and think about the holiday of Pesach, and think about the story of the Jewish people within the context of brand identification. I began by talking about the Pacific Coast Biscuit Company and the incongruence to our eye of having a swastika on a box of matzah. But a brand is really a collection of experiences and associations that are connected with a particular company or entity. When I talk about, if I mention to you Nike, people are familiar with the Nike brand, think of the swoosh. A person, if I mentioned the car company Jaguar, so you think about the hood ornament on the car. Think about Rolls-Royce. Everyone knows what the hood ornament on a Rolls-Royce looks like. It's very clear. There's a certain brand identification that comes with that. And part of effective branding involves the ability to create a simple yet profound association with a particular product. So it could be argued that matzah is the brand for Pesach. Indeed, we refer to Pesach as Chag HaMatzot, the festival of matzah. So what is the core symbolism? What's the true reason for matzah? Is it slavery? Is it being oppressed? Or is it our freedom? Okay, I want to talk about a few other contradictions. When we talk about the story of the Exodus, the Haggadah begins, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayo Avosenu. Initially, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Normally, when we think about the history and the ancestry of the Israelites, we go back to the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then their sons, the 12 tribes. We begin not with Abraham, not with Abraham, but with Terach, Avi Abraham. Terach was an idol worshiper. What does he have to do with the story of the Jewish people? It's also, while we're talking about idol worship, it's noteworthy that the Karban Pesach, the Passover offering itself, had to be a sed, had to be a lamb. This was an animal that was worshipped by the ancient Egyptians. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to offer something else? It could be a kosher, the Torah wasn't given yet, but maybe we could have offered up a deer or something else for the Passover offering. Why would we want to do something that could be seen as giving credence to Egyptian idolatry when we're transitioning from being servants to Pharaoh to servants of God? The Haggadah continues, and in relating the history of our patriarchs, it says, "Ve'etin le'esav es har seir l'reshet oto v'Yaakov." And God gave Esav the mount of Seir to inherit, but Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. V'Yaakov uvanav yardu Mitzrayim. Why is this particular piece of historical information about Esav important to us? I mean, we're focusing on the history of the Israelites, the Jewish people. What if Esav seems to be a divergent theme? What does it have to do with our story? And then we could continue in the Seder. There's another custom, well known, after the conclusion of the meal, and Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals. At that point, we conclude the recitation of Hallel, but the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, brings a custom. And at that point, there's a custom to open up the front door to one's house. Kedei lizkor shehulel shimurim v'zchus amunazu yavo Mashiach v'yishbo chamaso al hamachashim. That this is an expression of our faith, that tonight is Lel Shimurim, tonight is a night that God protects us, God as our protector and our redeemer. And we demonstrate that by opening the door to our home. And it's interesting, one of the commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law, the Magen Avram, says, V'hecha t'shechiach hazeka lo sumchin an anisa. But if you're living in a place, you're living in a time where it's dangerous outside, don't open your door, because you shouldn't rely on a miracle. Now, this isn't part and parcel of the biblically obligated service of the evening, but it's interesting. Once again, it's another custom, it's another symbolism. And even here, we recognize that throughout most of history, the Jewish nation, and particularly the Ashkenazi community, was living in places where they were under constant threat. It wasn't always safe to open your door and to demonstrate your rituals and the celebration of Judaism and the observance of Torah in a public manner. So are we supposed to feel redemption? Are we still supposed to feel the bitterness of exile? Okay, so we have many, many contradictions. What is the focus of this evening, of the Seder night? Is it freedom or is it servitude? At any given point in history, what do we see? How are we supposed to feel? What are we supposed to think about when we're eating our matzah, drinking our wine, when we're dipping these different foods? So I want to share, there's a beautiful and a very simple answer by Rabbi Dr. Abraham Torsky. And I think it is such a profound message for our time. Rabbi Torsky says, we do not need to reconcile every conflict. He says the questions and the contradictions on the Seder night represent an essential aspect of spirituality, the ability to live with conflict. A lot of the emphasis on modern psychology and therapy is the resolution of contention and resolving conflicts. People don't want to be uncomfortable. We want to be happy. We don't want to live with stress. And living with ongoing stress has become unthinkable. And many people find themselves engaged in struggles that are not easily resolvable, and they'll want to escape this through almost any means possible. Look, there's sometimes people will, whether it's a prescription medicine, whether it's addiction, whether it's alcohol addiction or addiction to drugs, there's many people that will turn to anything to be able to avoid having to deal with difficult stressors and ongoing conflict, and it's understandable. We strive for simplicity. We want to be happy. We don't want to be living in a state of tension. But Dr. Torsky argues that this lack of tolerance for conflict and stress has a profound impact on our interpersonal relationships as well as our interpersonal psyche. Our inability to withstand conflict and our desire to seek immediate relief is something that has inhibited our maturity, not just in terms of spirituality, but our psychological and emotional maturation. Says Rabbi Torsky, the Pesach Seder, which is the feast of spirituality, is characterized by the coexistence of conflicting ideas. The concept of freedoms espoused in the Torah is very different from the concept of freedom that maybe we're used to in our society. I was just looking a few minutes ago at a quote by Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks here about what he calls Sunday neurosis. And he says with automation, and this is going back, I mean, we're going back decades ago, but he talks about this widespread phenomenon in the 20th century that he calls the existential vacuum, where he says that due to automation, that we have more free time than ever before. And what he was seeing in his practice at that time as a psychiatrist is that people not knowing what to do with their newfound freedom. And many people he describes as suffering from the Sunday neurosis, where it's either a depression, anxiety, or both, of just not having a meaning or focus or purpose in their lives, but having plenty of time to think about all the things that they do and they don't have. So according to many people, the ultimate aim of freedom is the absence of any discord, right? That no stress, no conflicts, no trouble, no problems, no anxiety. But Rabbi Torsky wants to argue that Torah freedom includes the capacity to manage stress and the ability to achieve serenity even in the face of conflict, essentially to be able to thrive in an imperfect world. Okay, what do we do with these conflicts in our lives? Let's get very real here. There's something that I talk about on a yearly basis, and both as a rabbi and as a mental health professional. I get plenty of calls before Pesach, not just in terms of which products I'm allowed to eat and not eat, or how do I kosher my kitchen. But there's something that I call Pesach panic, and it's manifested different ways. But some of the signs of Pesach panic are multiple trips to the grocery store, people hoarding matzah, macaroons, and potato starch. There are times where sometimes you can go into a kosher market and it reminds me of a Orson Welles film, an apocalyptic scene of people just running, grabbing anything they can off the shelves. This is compounded obviously this year with the COVID-19 virus, with this pandemic that is worldwide at this point, and many people are making Pesach for the first time. Many people are making Pesach for the first time in their home on their own. They haven't done it in years, but many people, this is the very first time they've ever had to make Pesach at home. And it's absolutely overwhelming. In addition to that, many of us look forward to being together with family for Pesach. I have to say on a personal note, we were looking forward to our Seder with all of our kids and all of our grandkids around our table. This is the first time that all of our children, all of our sons-in-law, all of our grandchildren would have all been together under our roof for Pesach. It's not going to happen. All of our families are making Pesach in our own homes because we're all under quarantine. It's our mother-in-law. My mother-in-law always joins us for Pesach. She's going to be home. She's going to be making a Seder alone on Pesach night. This is very difficult, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's people on this call who are also going to be alone for Pesach. This is not easy. It's very challenging. And then aside from the fact that almost all of us probably know of someone personally, or know of someone who knows someone personally who's sick, who's struggling with health issues right now, who may be in the hospital due to the coronavirus. I have students of mine who lost parents. A dear student of mine buried his father on Friday. There wasn't even a minyan because of quarantine. There wasn't a minyan at the cemetery to be able to say Kaddish. Thankfully, he's with his brothers, but they're alone the entire week. No one is able to come and visit to be able to offer them any consolation. This year, the Seder will be very challenging, very difficult for many of us, and there's not a clear end in sight. How do we engage a holiday which is one of the most festive times of the year, and at the same time manage this knowledge of this conflict and the fear and all the unknown that exists around us? So I think we need to develop this idea of Rabbi Torsky about spiritual maturity. And the spiritual maturity requires an understanding that life can be both sweet and bitter at the same time. In fact, life will be bitter, that there's no escape from bitterness in life. The question is, how do we engage this? How do we coexist with it? And I think this goes to an understanding and an acceptance, not just of that reality, but also an understanding of what Zman Cherutenu means. What does it mean that this is the holiday of our freedom? On July 4th, 1776, the very day that the 13 United States of America declared independence from Great Britain, the Continental Congress convened a committee, and they charged this committee to design the seal, the symbol of U.S. sovereignty. And it was comprised of three men, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. And ironically, two out of the three, Jefferson and Franklin, suggested a depiction of the children of Israel leaving Egypt. One suggested a depiction of the splitting of the Red Sea and the downfall of Pharaoh. The other one suggested a depiction of the Israelites traveling through the desert, being led by God. And when I was a child, I remember studying U.S. history and learning about these men, along with two others who drafted the Declaration of Independence. And in all, there were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence. But it wasn't until many years later that I discovered the true price of their conviction. Of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, 5 of them were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 of them had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons in the Revolutionary War. Another one had 2 sons that were captured. 9 of them fought and died from wounds during the war. Carter Braxton of Virginia, who was a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship sunk by the British Army. He had to sell his home and properties to pay his debts, and he died in poverty. Thomas Nelson's home was overrun by British General Cornwallis. Nelson told George Washington, who was the general at that time, to open fire on the home, and his home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. Their 13 children ran for their lives. His fields and mills were destroyed, and over a year later, he was living in a forest, hiding in caves. He finally came back to his home. His wife had passed away, and his children were gone. And a few weeks later, he succumbed and died from exhaustion. True freedom does not mean the absence of bitterness, of stress, or conflict. Often we find, and if you look at revolutions throughout history, stress and conflict is the very price of freedom. What is the cherut? What's the freedom that the Torah seeks to convey? So clearly, we have to have the ability to live, to coexist with stress and conflict. You know, we eat the Pesach, Matzah, and Maror together. That's the sandwich of Hillel. That the sweet, the bitterness, our freedom, our humble origins, all of this are rolled together. And if we don't do this, if we ignore any part of this, if we only succumb to our fears, if we only focus on the bitterness, if we get stuck in the past and focus on our suffering, even if we get stuck in the present, depending on what we're facing at any time in our individual or collective history, if we don't look forward to the future, one has not truly experienced the Pesach Seder. There has to be both the bad and the good, the bitterness and the sweetness, the sense of lack and a sense of fulfillment, of freedom. Okay, so Maror, what does Maror symbolize? So we said that we remember how we suffered in Egypt, but it's more than that. More than just the bitterness and anguish in Egypt. What does maror do? So remember, when we eat the maror, we dip the maror in the charoset, even if we don't eat the charoses. But on the simple level, we're acknowledging the reality that life can be harsh and bitter. Yet nevertheless, we dip it into the charoses. And on a simple level, we recognize that life is neither bitter or sweet. It's both. And throughout history, if you think about it, probably maror was the reality of our historical existence, right? Most of the time, a Jew was sitting at his or her Seder, and they're drinking wine, and they're reading the story of the Exodus, and they're reclining while they're under the subjugation of a nation who hated them, who was taxing them, who was taxing them, who was issuing decrees against Jewish worship and Jewish study. We play the role of royalty even while our enemies persecute us and oppress us and embitter our lives. But through that, we actually are able to transcend any time and place. I remember when I was traveling with a group of high school students years ago to Eastern Europe, and I learned something very interesting about Poland before the war. And our guide was just giving us some insight in terms of the Jewish community that it's frightening when you think about it, that pre-World War II Poland, the Jews comprised 10% of the country's population. And at least from what our tour guide shared, that the Jews really created the middle class. She said in Poland that the Jews, once a week, they would stop working. They would take whatever they had, would become their Sabbath best, and they would have a day of celebration. And they had to, maybe save and scrimp throughout the week to be able to have a little bit more for Shabbos. But those times of holidays and those times of Shabbos allowed them to transcend their peasant lifestyle, and that attitude and that approach lifted them up even economically. That Viktor Frankl talks about how the last of the human freedoms, even if we're restricted in every other way, is the freedom to choose our attitude in any set of circumstances. And there's no guarantee, but there's many circumstances where our attitude can actually lead to decisive action and can improve our quality of life. Okay, so part of what Marar is representing is that without Marar, Charosis loses its value. Meaning that if you only have sweet, if you only have good, the world is not a world full of unicorns and cotton candy and rainbows. There are challenges of life, and as we'll see, that there's a very functional purpose to those challenges as well. But without bitter, you don't have sweet. Without darkness, you don't have light. Without sadness, you don't have joy. And out of our struggle comes a very inspired and noble outcome. Why does the Haggadah need to tell us that Esav inherited the Mount of Seir? What does that have to do with Pesach? Yaakov and his sons go down to Egypt. That's really our story. That's our history. So on a simple level, the Haggadah perhaps is contrasting the experience of Esav, which from him would come the nation of the nations of Greece and Rome, and Yaakov. From Yaakov would come the Jewish people, the Israelites. Esav had no experience in exile, and he later had no right to the Holy Land, the land of Canaan, which would eventually become Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. It was the experience of the children of Yaakov, of the Israelites in Egypt, that was a prerequisite for our nationhood. Egypt is described by our sages, by our Talmudic sages, as the crucible from which we emerged as a stronger and as a more compassionate nation. The Egyptian exile was a school of hard knocks. And we see this, and this is, the Torah mentions this specifically, and there are certain laws in the Torah that reference our experience in Egypt. In Egypt, we learned how to love when we were hated. We learned how to have faith in the midst of despair. We learned how to give when it seems like everything was taken from us. Specifically, we learned how to treat the stranger, the poor, the oppressed, because as the Torah says, Ki gerim hayisem be'eretz Mitzrayim, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know how it feels. You know what it's like to suffer. You know what it's like to struggle. Now that you have that sense of empathy, share it and make it manifest with other people. So the bitterness of the Egyptian exile and the maror that we eat to represent that, it's not just one of that every cloud has a silver lining, but it's to remind us that through bitterness, through hardship, through suffering, can come greatness if we choose our attitude and we choose to take decisive action based on the capacity for empathy and our experience of those difficult times, of those challenging times. Okay. Why do we recline the second time we eat maror, but not the first time? Meaning, if maror ultimately is necessary for our redemption, why not recline the first time? So I want to suggest that there's a metaphor here, that geula, redemption, is not a single event, it's a process. This relates to matzah as well. We move from being oppressed to freedom. We move from being disempowered to empowered. And the very symbols of our oppression eventually, over time, become our victory song, our victory dance. Right? If you think about it, the maror itself becomes a condiment for the carbon Pesach. Like, what is when a person has a steak or you have meat and you put horseradish on the meat, the condiment brings out the true flavor of the main course of what it is that you're eating. This is really the purpose of Korach, of the sandwich of Hillel. That unfortunately, where's the beef? We're lacking the carbon Pesach. But this process for our striving for ultimate redemption, of transforming maror from a symbol of misfortune to a symbol of good fortune, is what we act out at the Pesach Seder. We act out for this transformational process. We act out this transformational process of redemption. Okay, what about the carbon Pesach? Why is it that we bring a lamb, which was an Egyptian idol, essentially? So I think this teaches us that the avodah zarah, that the idol itself is something that we were able to fashion into a carbon LaHashem, into an offering to God. Many times our challenge as Jews isn't to throw away or ignore everything that goes on outside of the parameters of our Torah life, but to recognize that there are many things that we have the capacity to sanctify. And if we strive wherever possible, we can direct many mundane things to a higher purpose. And I think that's why our ancestry begins with Terach, the idol worshiper. We reject the worship of idols, but we don't deny where we came from. In Torah, we don't whitewash our history. We seek to learn from it, to grow from it. We succeed not despite it, but because of it. Terach, the father of Avram, had mistaken misconceptions of God, but he knew that there was something bigger than him. He recognized that there's a need to worship. And similarly, matzah has to be made with the same things, the same 5 species of grain, that if you allow them to ferment, they can become chametz. We can make matzah out of potatoes. There's plenty of other things. I think everything else we have on Pesach is made out of potato starch. But perhaps part of the lesson here is the very substance of something that can become chametz, that can become something that's forbidden for us to eat on Pesach. We take that same thing, and by crafting it carefully and quickly, we make it into the very thing which we're obligated to eat on Pesach. And in so many ways, the stages of the Seder are instructional for our own lives. Every family has a story. A family that was once very wealthy that loses its fortune. They can turn against one another in blame and vindictiveness, family fights that can go on for years. Or they can learn how to cultivate their inner resources of maturity and wisdom. A child is sick. God forbid parents lose a child. The stress can cause parents to become so estranged from one another. But it's also that stress can allow the parents to draw closer in their support from one another and become closer than they ever were before. From the bitterness, which we don't desire and we don't ask for, but the bitterness which is inevitable to human life, can come something sweet, can come something noble and great. When a loved one passes away, when our parents pass away, we can become devastated and totally caught up in our own grief, or we can perpetuate their memory by memorializing them in the form of charity, in the form of educating others, of healing for the sick. From death can come life. So these different stages of the Seder, where we learn to coexist, where we recognize that there's a combination of the bitter and the sweet, can apply not just to our national identity, but to our individual identities as well. On the Seder night, despite our uncertainty about the future, we strive to transcend our current worries and concerns. In 1992, the New York sociologist William Helmreich studied Holocaust survivors to determine how they handled life after barely escaping genocide. And he traveled across America. He interviewed 170 survivors. And at that time, the conventional wisdom was that they all suffered from incapacitating trauma. So he expected to meet people who were chronically depressed, anxious, and fearful. And to his surprise, he found out that most survivors had adapted to their new lives far more successfully than anyone could have imagined. And he stresses that these weren't exceptional people. These weren't people that, were divorced from reality. They had suffered. They were traumatized. But he writes, and I quote, "The story of the survivors is one of courage and strength, of people who are living proof of the indomitable will of the human being to survive and their tremendous capacity for hope. It's not the story of remarkable people, it's the story of how remarkable people can be. Rachel Yehuda, who's a leading authority on post-traumatic stress disorder and resilience, also studied the survivor population. And she says that many people want to believe that people are resilient or vulnerable, strong or weak, healthy or sick. What she wants to argue is that resilience is not a constant or steady state. She says that that people can be many different things at once, and in reality, most people combine these qualities. In life, we experience the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Marar, all rolled up together. In her book, Secrets of the Past, Bridges to the Future, Dr. Annette Labovitz relates the following story about the last Seder in the Warsaw Ghetto. It was April of 1943, and a young boy named Mordechai was sitting with his family around their table. They did not have matzah, wine, or anything resembling a holiday meal. They had no marar. But bitterness surrounded them. The ghetto was burning, bombs were exploding all around, and the sound of marching soldiers drowned out the cries of the resistance fighters who were trying bravely to withstand the Nazi onslaught. Young Mordechai had just finished asking his father the 4 questions of the Manashtana. Father, I've just asked you the 4 questions about the exodus of our people from Egypt, but I still have one more question to ask. Father, will I be here tomorrow? Tears streamed down the father's face as he turned to his young son and answered, My dearest Mordechai, I cannot promise you I'll be here tomorrow. I can't promise you that you'll be here tomorrow, but I swear to you that there'll always be Jewish children who will ask the Manashtana, who will continue that which is holy to the Jewish people. The Haggadah tells us, Afilu kulanu chachamim mitzvah l'saper yitzias Mitzrayim, even if all of us were wise. And let's face it, if you do that story, if you observe the Seder every year, we know the story of the Exodus. The Minchas Asher, Rav Asher Weiss asks, what is the mitzvah of l'saper, to tell the story? Why doesn't it state zecher? It's a mitzvah lizkor, to remember the Egyptian Exodus. Indeed, this is a mitzvah we have every single day of the year. What is sipor? What does it mean to tell the story? He says it's not about knowledge, it's not about facts, it's not about wisdom or analysis. It's about hargasha, it's about emotion. It's about making an emotional connection, connecting emotionally to our history, to our destiny. Rav Nachman of Breslov says the purpose of the story of the Exodus is to wake us up, to inspire us. That's why we do things so differently than the rest of the year. That's why we have customs, just to get people to break our patterns, to break our routines, to ask questions, to explore, to feel. One of the great gifts I've had over the course of my life is that I was able to grow up knowing both my paternal and maternal grandparents. Both of my grandfathers lived through the Great Depression, and both of them served overseas during World War II. They both volunteered for the army. It was a different time back then. They were both very patriotic. One of my grandfathers told me when he signed up for the army, he didn't think that he would ever come back alive. It was like, he just, this was my duty, this is my responsibility, this is what I have to do. My other grandfather was part of the invasion of Normandy. I can't even imagine the horror and the trauma that he endured. But when both of them came back from the war, they hung up their uniforms and they went back to civilian life. And you would never know of what they experienced during wartime. You'd never know what they experienced during the Depression unless you asked them about it. But there was something that I noticed, and I didn't really understand the significance until years later, but both of my grandfathers, when they would eat, either during the week or on Shabbos, whether we were at home or in a restaurant, they would sit the entire meal and they would be clutching a piece of bread in their left hand. So the fork was in their right hand, the bread was in their left hand. Now, thank God, neither of my grandfathers was at a loss for sustenance. There was always plenty of food in their kitchens, the pantry and the freezer. But both of them knew what it was to be hungry. And that bread which they clutched in their hand represented the basic staple of sustenance. And it served as a constant reminder of the fragility of wealth and the appreciation that every meal that they had was a luxury and not an entitlement. To Pesach Seder, we sing the song of Dayenu. that then we go through and we enumerate all of these different steps, all these different things that God did for us. And we say, if you would have just done this, it would have been enough. There's many different parts of the curriculum of the Seder night, but one certainly is to appreciate what we have. We're very fortunate to be living in a time and a place where we arguably, certainly in the Ashkenazi community, have more freedom and opportunity than any time in the past 2 millennia of Jewish history. We also have the capacity to look back and remember what's happened in the past and compare it to what we have now, even with all of our current challenges, even with the current anxieties that we have. The matzah that we ate in the past, that we ate on the first celebration of Passover in Egypt, the matzah that we eat throughout history, the matzah that we eat now, transcends time and place. In Egypt, we ate the matzah as a bread of affliction, yet that very matzah foreshadowed the future. In the Second Temple, we ate the matzah as the bread of redemption, and we remembered the oppression of the past, and foreshadowing future oppression, but then future redemption. The matzah we commemorate, and we can connect with the totality of Jewish experience, to the highs and the lows of our communal story. And that's why perhaps matzah has been the most effective and consistent brand in the history of Jewish life. You know, the swastika could come and go. Hitler's predicted 1,000-year Reich, with all of its hubris, lasted 12 years and 4 months. Yet the Jew, with his or her lowly matzah, is at a couple thousand years and counting. Even in the darkest and most foreboding periods of history, the matzah inspires us with the message of joy and hope. And during every golden age, during years of plenty, the matzah reminds us to maintain our humility in the face of our newly acquired freedom. Viktor Frankl talks about Sunday neurosis, and certainly there does seem to be a correlation between freedom and anxiety. There's different ways, different methods of managing anxiety, but one of them, I think, is alluded to at the beginning of the Haggadah in the Halach Ma'anya, where we talk about the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt, and we say, Kol dichvin yeseh v'yechol, anyone who is famished, come and eat. Anyone who is in need should come and join us in the Passover festival. Fortunately, we can't invite people over this year, but there are things that we can do between now and then to be able to support those who have less, those who are in need. And whether it's through charity, whether it's just through a phone call, calling someone who's alone and connecting with them and letting them know that we're thinking about them, that indeed they're not alone. With our freedom comes responsibility. To borrow an idea once again from Frankl, he says, I recommend the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by the Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Years ago, I was studying in Jerusalem. There was a woman named Clara Hammer. And Mrs. Hammer passed away, I think it was about 15 years ago. She lived to almost 100 years old. Now, her real name was Clara Hammer. Throughout the world, she was known as the Chicken Lady. So most people are fortunate to live when they're at an elderly age, especially getting into 70, 80, 90, close to 100. Often they're dependent on the care and the support of others. But until really nearly the last days of her life, Clara Hammer was taking care of hundreds of poor families in Israel by providing them with chickens for Shabbos. And it started with an episode that occurred when she was already in her 70s. She was standing in line at the butcher, and she saw the butcher give a young girl a huge plastic bag. And the bag was filled with nothing but fat and skin. And the girl said, thank you, and she left. So Mrs. Hammer got to the front of the line, and she said to the butcher, how many dogs and cats does that family have? They need so many scraps. So he says, no, the family doesn't have any pets, but they have 7 children. The father's on dialysis. The family has little income. And he says, unfortunately, I can't afford to give them any more because they've already run up such a tab, but I want to give them something, so at least I'll give them some fat and skin for the chicken soup. So this story struck Clara's heart. She immediately told the butcher, she said, from now on, give the family chopped meat, give them a whole chicken, I'll pay for it. And this was just the beginning. She started with this one family, and soon it became 2. Until eventually 150 families in Jerusalem were coming in there into this butcher, and they were getting meat and chicken for Shabbos, running up a bill of over $1,000. And so Clara started, she gave everything that she possibly could, and then she started collecting contributions, inspiring other people around the world to give. And I remember an interview with her where she recalled to the reporter her own experience with hunger, her own taste of bitterness. She was captured as a young girl with her family while they were trying to sneak across the border from Romania into Russia. And the family was put in jail for 7 weeks, and they were given very little food. She says, I never, ever, ever forgot that experience. I remember to this day what it means to be hungry, what it means to cry, what it means to want another piece of bread. And my mother telling me, I'm sorry, I don't have. So at the age of 99, this woman had never forgotten her hunger. She never forgot the bitterness. She never forgot that taste of bitterness. So she provided for others because she could empathize with them. She could remember what it was like to be oppressed, to be hungry. And for those last 30 years at the end of her life, while most people would be reclining in their golden years, she did everything she could to provide rest, dignity, and sustenance to others. That, my friends, is matzah. That's the bread of affliction, the bread of freedom, the bread of responsibility. Matzah, which is the emblem of our slavery, becomes the very symbol of our freedom. And we carry this with a badge that is both a badge of honor and symbolic of humility at the same time. We live in the present, we recall our tumultuous past, and we await a glorious future. Thank you all for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Lerner, for that very meaningful presentation. If anyone has any questions that you would like to direct to Dr. Lerner, you could type it in now, and I'll read it to him. The one question that we have is that this year, whether it be the fact that some people be sitting alone or some people be sitting with a limited participants that they're used to, what could a person do to try to make the Seder a meaningful experience, despite the fact that for everyone it's not the ideal way they wanted to do it, and it's not how they planned? Is any practical thing or practical way they could approach the Seder per se to find it a fulfilling and uplifting experience?
Okay, so part of the challenge here, and I think this is also a lesson for life, is how do we make the most of what we have? How do we maximize whatever it is that we do have, as opposed to focusing on what we don't have? And I think that if we look, the Talmud mentions this, the Haggadah mentions this. I'm sorry, the Talmud actually mentions this, and it's brought in Jewish law that if a person is alone, even if I have my Seder alone, I'm supposed to ask the questions of the Manishtana. I'm supposed to actually discuss the Exodus from Egypt, even with myself. We're living in a time where so many of us are distracted constantly, where we're distracted by technology, and we forget about how it's interrupted and the adverse effect it has on our relationships with others and how interruptive it is. But even with ourselves, just getting to know ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with God. So let's talk about a person who's alone. What can I do if I'm alone on the night of the Seder to make my Seder meaningful? So I think that we have, just like in the prelude to the first Passover, there was a few days of preparation. We still have time. And thank God we can use technology to our advantage between now and Pesach. There's no shortage of, even if your local bookstore isn't delivering, there are, perhaps thousands of different versions of the Haggadah that are out there to give us different perspectives and insights into the story of the Exodus and lessons which we can apply to our lives. But thank God there's a wealth of knowledge which is online. I would say prepare in advance, print things out, have something new to be able to learn, to study, to consider on the night of Pesach. Think about, how does this apply to me now sitting here? How does this apply to my life? What am I responsible to do? What can I do to improve the lives of others, of the community? Let's use this as an opportunity to grow and to challenge ourselves. And if we're fortunate enough to have other people at our Seder, we can expand this discussion as well. But I think that, and I've really made a serious effort to do this with my own family in recent years. I mean, I've led so many Seders over the years, but I don't want it to be the same thing every year for my kids. And once again, this may be more challenging this year, but whether it's through costumes, whether it's through role playing. We really go out of our way to come up with something new and something novel every year at the Seder, to be able to keep everyone and to keep ourselves engaged as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Another comment that came in. Thank you, Rabbi, for your beautiful presentation. From the age of social media to the age of social distancing, how can we pass this incredible message of emunah, faith, and embracing conflict onto our children without causing anxiety? I mean, if you guide us how to teach or interact our children in a healthy way to what's going on, assuming that they're old enough to realize that there's a real problem out there.
Okay, so I think that first of all, as parents, the most important thing that we can do for our children is social modeling. I mean, more than any lecture we can give them, and I often tell people, and I'm very careful to abide by this myself, not to lecture your children. The most important thing, if you want to pass on Torah, you want to pass on Judaism, you want to pass on the heritage to your children and grandchildren, make it sustainable, they're going to have to love it. They're going to have to enjoy it. And I think the most effective way of doing that is if you are really emotionally connected to it, if you're engaged, if they see that you're excited, if they see that you have faith, if they see that you're confident, those characteristics will be conveyed to them as well. And I plenty of consults, even before the coronavirus. It's hard to believe people had anxiety before a couple months ago as well. And I'll often tell parents that many times our children will react based on our disposition and our behavior. That, if I'm neurotic and I'm worried and I'm constantly expressing my worries and anxieties, it's more likely my children are going to pick up on that, and they're going to view the world as dangerous and threatening. So I think that, how we comport ourselves is critical. And that's why we have to find ways of inspiring ourselves. We have to find ways of coexisting with our own anxieties, with our own worries. Worry and anxiety in and of itself, anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. Anxiety can be productive or it can be non-productive. All anxiety is using our imagination to consider future threats or challenges. So, if I'm considering a future threat, if there's something actionable that I can do, then my anxiety is productive. If there's nothing I can do, and all I can do is accept the reality that exists and navigate the best I can despite the unknown, then that's the most I can do. But to focus on our worries, and for that to be the constant theme of every discussion at the table, and certainly if the corona pandemic becomes the entire focus of the Seder discussion, that's going to be conveying a message to our children, is that this is the most important thing to be discussing tonight. I think that there's no guarantees. There's a lot to be uncertain about in life. I guess the only guarantee in life is uncertainty. But how we comport ourselves will impact our children more than anything that we could ever say or that we could tell them to do. So I think it begins with us, and it begins with us modeling our behavior. And on a national level, we really believe that in the end, everything will be okay. We will get past this. The challenge is that there's not a guarantee for every individual. So we have to be careful about, not making promises that we can't keep. But in the end, we'll be okay. And if it's not okay, it's not the end.
Thank you. Just one final question, then we'll conclude. Being that everyone's quarantined, those do have kids. The kids are in the house, and schools are off now, and the parents are busy with Pesach or with work. Any practical suggestions how to engage the children in a meaningful way, as opposed to them just sitting and watching TV for 12 hours?
That's a great question. Okay, so I would say for this week, something which we can do and which can, I think, lead to positive results, not just in terms of the next couple of days, but in terms of the Seder itself, is have our children participate in the preparation for Pesach. One of my daughters is upstairs right now. I didn't even know that she could do this. I know that she's artistically inclined, but she's making these beautiful, amazing, professionally looking centerpieces and decorations for for Pesach, for the Pesach Seder. We during holidays throughout the year, we do themes. So like we'll decorate our house for the different holidays, and I have a mural of Egypt that I put up. We hang up on the wall for the Pesach Seder. Like I said, we've done costumes before. I dress up as Pharaoh, as Paro for part of the Haggadah. I dress up as Moshe for part of the Haggadah as well. We have Jewish servant or slave costumes as well. But there, even just with what's at home, you don't have to run to Amazon for this. But sometimes children have a dress-up box at home. Have them prepare costumes for a skit to act out parts of the Seder. There's a long-standing tradition that many people have of actually acting out the redemption from Egypt. So depending, it has to be obviously age appropriate, but it could be role playing. It could be preparing costumes. It could be preparing decorations, decorating the room, decorating the house. It could be props for the 10 plagues and various aspects of the Seder. And if they're older and more intellectually capable, have them come up with a list of questions. Of things that could be a relevant and meaningful discussion about the Seder or themes related to the Seder. I think the more you can involve them in preparation, and probably there are parents that could use help in preparing for the Seder, the more invested they'll be when we get to Pesach itself.
Thank you so much for this meaningful evening. We wish you a Chag Kosher v'Sameach, and everyone else, all the participants in the entire world, please God, should be safe and healthy. Tomorrow morning at the 5th Avenue, we're going to have a virtual davening beginning at 8 o'clock. Yisrael Halper will be delivering the Dvar Torah at the end of davening. And we thank everyone for joining us. And please God, everyone should have a happy and healthy Pesach. And please God, Yeshuot, many happy occasions to our community, the Jewish world, and entire world, and in the speedy, very, very soon, please God, may have come upon us. Have a good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.